there's no lighting in here, and about 6 o'clock it's going to get dark, so we're going to get right to the service here, so I'm just going to take a few minutes. This church was founded in 1746, and Oliver Hart was born in Warminster, Pennsylvania on July 6, 1723. He was saved at the age of 18, and then he was ordained here in Southampton, Pennsylvania. The same year he was called to the Baptist Church in Charleston, South Carolina. We talked about how that he was down there, and then when the Revolution came, all of those Baptist preachers with the occupation of Charleston fell, and Cornwallis had moved in, and that was really the first Southern campaign. And but nonetheless, he was well acquainted with Whitefield and Tennant, and as a patriot, traveled in South Carolina to enlighten the people in regard to their political interests. We talked about how these guys could go into town and they'd walk into a town of Tories, and by the end of the day, they'd have them all convinced to be Whigs and to fight for the cause. And so we praise the Lord for that. Much more I'd like to say there. But by the way, when your Baptist forefathers won the Battle of Kings Mountain, that basically extinguished Tory recruitment. Tory recruitment basically nosedived. Tarleton was the guy that was real good at that. And once the native sons of the soil realized they could win, they stopped joining the other side basically and would become Whigs and fight for the cause. And so he was a big part of that, Oliver Hart was. He became pastor in Hopewell, New Jersey in 1780. As we mentioned, he left during the Revolution, came up, and then he died there December 31st, 1795. Now, some interesting things we haven't brought out about Oliver Hart. His grave's here, so I wanted to mention him while we're here. Cathcart says that among his publications are, quote, Dancing Exploded. Amen? It almost gives you a visual, all right? I can tell he didn't like dancing very much. And then a discourse on the death of Reverend William Tennant, 1777. And then, quote, The Christian Temple. And then, quote, A circular letter on Christ's mediatorial character. And then finally, quote, The Christian Remembrancer. So Hart left here, and then he traveled to South Carolina, was there in 1751, founded the Second Baptist Association in America. As we mentioned, Philadelphia was the first, and then Charleston became the second. That became the most influential association probably in America. And Hart became good friends with Richard Furman while he was there. And then again, when the British invaded Charleston, there was a price on these guys' heads. And so he came back, and then that's when he would go over and pastor at the first church that we stopped at today. And he was pastored over there, but then he was ultimately buried over here. And so we're not going to give you much more history about it, but what I'd like to do is...
I'm one of 7 trustees for the church. The church has not had a congregation really in almost 60 years. And even at that, back in the 50s, they were down to a handful of people. They had a pastor that came up from Delaware once a month. So it was a slow process. The real heyday of this church was probably in the mid-1850s to the early 1900s. The building will hold 400 people. And if you stop and think, even 100 years ago, this was all farmland. Never mind 250 years ago. So keeping that in mind, the population was not that great. So this church accounted for a great deal of the people in the area. Not too far from here, about a mile away, is another church, the Northampton Southampton Reformed Church. It was built almost at the same time. So I almost have to say that between the two churches, they had it all tied up. A little bit of a history. This group came up here from Philadelphia, from Cruztown Road, and I don't know if you've been down there or not. That church still exists today. Philadelphia church that came up here for the farmland. This is Bucks County. Bucks County has been known for years and years for extremely fertile ground. So they came up at that time to take over farming. Originally they had services in their homes, and in 1731 they built a small church on the other side of the cemetery. This building was built in 1772, so it's roughly 250 years old. A lot of history. We're fortunate because we have 11 books. This is book number 1. We have 11 of these books. And they're like a history book, or like really like a diary. In these books, are all in the weddings, funerals, and so forth. Unfortunately, they didn't see fit to put all the weddings in one book and all the funerals in a separate book. They've got them dispersed between all of these books. But what would happen is oftentimes, keeping in mind that in those days the church was really the community. Weddings, baptisms, funerals, all done through the church. This particular church, I don't know whether others did it or not, this particular church, if your kids wanted to buy a farm in the area, they came to the church for the money and they held the mortgage on the farm. So you can see where it's all tied together. Where you're sitting, the pews were rented by the year. The one figure I saw in one of the books was $6.50 to $8.50. So I don't know whether the expensive ones were up front or in the back. But if you look at the pews, you'll see many of them have carpeting. And if you were to look from one pew to another, you'll find that it's almost all different carpeting. Because as a family, that was my family right there, for example. And I put the carpeting in there that I had. And they put the carpeting down to keep the pews warmer so that the floor wasn't cold. It's just like those stools that are in there. A lot of people, when they come in here, they say, oh, well, they're for kneeling. Well, no, they weren't for kneeling. They were for putting your feet on to get them off the cold floor. So, again, you can see where this all tied together. Picnics, all different activities amongst the families. Along with that, of course, is, when your whole family for years has been coming to this church, your folks and your brothers and sisters come to this church, the church has the mortgage on your farm, big brother's thumb. Okay, the church controlled what went on. The advantage of these books is, as I started to mention, there's a lot of history in them. But after, not every church service, but periodically, they would have church community meetings. And they would discuss, so forth, what they wanted to do. This particular book started in 1731. And in the book, it discusses their plans for the new meeting house, this building. And you sit in your family room reading it, and it's beautiful writing. It's a little hard to read. C's look like S's and so forth. You sort of have to read back and forth to get the gist of it. But they had that information in there. In 1845, there was a major split in the church. They talk about getting a group together to check with the pastor because they felt that he was having services outside of the church. Well, that was a no-go. And they got a group together, they reported back to the congregation, no, he wasn't. And they renewed, I don't know whether they called it a contract or not, but I'll use that word. They renewed his contract for the next group of years. And no sooner had they done that than they discovered, yep, he was. And they fired him. And he left, and he took a whole group of the congregation with him. And he went up Street Road, which is just down here, about a mile away, and started the Davisville Baptist Church. The difference is, recently, about a year ago, Davisville dropped the name Baptist. As you know, a lot of churches today, they're fooling around with the names. They don't want to call it a Methodist or this or that, or they now start calling it the Creekside Church. You don't know what it is. They dropped the name Baptist, so it's now the Davisville Church. So you can already see, wow, they're still doing things a little differently. However, that church is very alive and very active. And this one is, as I said, is long since died. Another kind of a unique thing when you read in the book, you find that they are accusing those people that went up there to that church of coming back here in the middle of the night and digging up mom and pop and moving them up there. So, I mentioned some of these things. We think we're screwed up today. Things were 150 years ago, but the church is very active. So this particular church, as I said, has not had a congregation of any description really for almost 60 years. For many, many years, it just simply sat here. Maybe once a year it was used for a wedding. Somebody in the neighborhood knew about it. They wanted to have their wedding here. That was about it. I got involved with it. My ancestors were involved with this church. They're, in fact, buried right out here. I got involved with it when we moved into this area about 18 years ago, I guess. And I have a tendency, we're all strange in our own way. I have a tendency to aggravate people on purpose. And we had a trustee meeting one day, and I was there. And it's this old, frankly, a little group of old fogies that were, just did things certain ways. And they got into the subject of fire insurance. Well, we need to increase the fire insurance in the building. I said, what are you going to do that for? Well, in case there's a fire. I said, so if it half burns down, what are you going to do? You're going to rebuild it for what? It just sits here. So that got us into a whole other conversation. Shortly after that, we had somebody develop a website for us. So we have our own website. And we then started weddings. And we have weddings, usually 12, 15, 18 weddings a year. We haven't had any in the last 2 years, but usually 15, 18 weddings a year. And it's not for the income from the wedding, it's to have a purpose for the church, for maintaining the church. So we also then started the Friends of the Meeting House. That was started about 10 years ago. We have a membership group of about 125 people, and every year they get, if you have a chance to look at that newsletter, and unfortunately that's one from a year ago. It's a very brief one. Most of them are about 4 pages long. We put it out each year in January or the beginning of February. It tells a little bit about what we're doing for the building. And that's sent out to the members. And that does bring us an income. And we fortunately have one person that every year writes us a check for $10,010. The $10 is his annual membership. The $10,000 is the gift. And he has relatives that are buried out here. So we've spent a lot of money on it. We just concluded this year finishing this wall all the way around the cemetery. It was totally torn down and over 4 years rebuilt it. That cost us about $65,000. We spent $60,000, had all of these windows taken out and carted over to New Jersey because the glazing was so old that when we had some storms, the window panes were literally falling out. And they would land in the grass, they wouldn't even break, but they would fall out. So we had all the windows taken out. New roof put on it about 10 years ago. That was another $50,000. So altogether between here and the house next door was a caretaker's home. It wasn't a pastor's home. And that's rented. And that's primarily where the income comes from to support this. We're very fortunate in that way. A lot of churches, as you well know, no money, no repairs, just falls down. This was originally 12 acres. Obviously, it's been consolidated. A mile from here, on the other side of Southampton, where the turnpike is, and there's a lot of industrial buildings, the church owned 112 acres, and that's where the pastor lived, and he could farm and sell the produce and so forth. So, we'll keep getting longer. I know you're on a close time schedule, and you're going to run out of daylight. That's the biggest problem.